So we're really pleased today to have our winning poet from the Fresher Writing Prize 2020 joining us, Sigrid Daniel. Obviously, in normal circumstances, we'd have been in the Fresher Publishing studios, but unfortunately, that's not the case. So we've got a far more sort of homely look to the studios at the moment. But hello, Sigrid. Thank you so much for coming to join us.
Hi, thanks, Emma. Thanks very much for setting this up. I think we've all got a bit more used to Zoom meetings, but this is the first interview for me. I've just been with people I know on Zoom. So, yeah.
Is it your first poetry reading on Zoom as well?
Yeah, no, my second, because I did do a dry run with a friend last week when I found out that I'd be reading. So, yeah.
All right. Well, look, we're so pleased to have the chance, first of all, to sort of talk to you, find out a bit more about your background as a writer, and then we're looking forward to hearing you reading the winning poem, Brother, a little bit later. Just to sort of pause for a minute about your win, and about Brother, because it was a poem that early on, this year we were absolutely deluged with entries.
Wow.
I think we did have the highest number of entries ever.
Gosh.
And so it was quite a task sort of going through them all, very enjoyable task, but quite a task. And Brother stood out early on. There was something about it that just attracted the judges. And Anthony Dunn, who's our poetry judge, when he made the final decision that Brother was the one that needed to win, made quite a few notes about it. And one of the things he said was that he loved the way that the poem didn't feel the need to tell us everything, and it left us to work our imaginations and fill in the gaps in the stories. And I love that. And I find that actually that's something, because I lecture in creative writing at the university as well. And that's something I'm often telling the undergraduates is about, is almost trust the reader, let them have that pleasure, have that joy of trying to work out what's going on behind it. But I wonder if you could perhaps give us a little bit of background to the poem, Brother.
Yeah, it was something I'd wanted to write about for a while. And I think I had several images in my head, that have now come through in the poem, but they were always much more like episodes or anecdotes, or they were much fuller descriptions. Because the poem is about my brother, and it is about my relationship with my brother, and it is about things that we did and things that we experienced together growing up. And I had written about my brother, Eve, but in a very kind of roundabout way. And I found it very hard to approach the subject because I think my brother suffered from mental illness from when he was about 19. Possibly earlier, but, it really manifested itself from 19. And I think really I was a couple of years younger than him. So from when I was 17, I was always really confused, sad, fascinated by what he was going through. There were a lot of emotions attached to it. There was a lot of trauma, his, mine, our families. And I think the first time I really sort of started to consciously write about mental illness, I actually did a PhD on mental illness in 19th and 20th century literature, and how people with mental illness were represented in great works of fiction. And so I looked at Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. I looked at Henry James's Turn of the Screw. I looked at The Prisoner of Monte Cristo. And it was always just a way of trying to essentially understand my brother's experience, but by looking at literary experiences, because that was my interest, that was my passion. And it wasn't really until a friend pointed it out to me that I realized that's what I was doing. And he said, "It's incredible. You've created this whole structure and work, and it's all about your brother, but you're not, you never talk about him." And that made me think, well, why don't I talk about him, and why don't I write about him? And it's essentially because when you go through schizophrenia, you do lose your own voice, because you have so much that goes on in your mental state, and so many other voices and experiences that sort of overlayer what your loved ones kind of consider to be your voice. And obviously he almost lost the right of reply, and I felt it would be wrong to write about him. And in fact, if he hadn't died recently, I would probably talk about the poem, but maybe not talk about my brother specifically in the poem. Or if I were to talk to you about the poem, I may not make so many connections with him, because I felt it was always very unfair, because it was easy for those of us who were left in the rational world to write, research, think, reflect, discuss, but very hard for him.
I find that really interesting because I suppose, is that because you had in your mind that by writing a poem like that, it might ultimately end up in the public domain? Or was it, even though you were writing something that could just have been for yourself, you still had that sense of his right to reply?
Yeah, well, both really, because when I wrote the poem, I wrote it at an Arvon retreat, and I went to poetry because I wanted to start taking my creative writing more seriously, and I actually thought that by going to poetry and starting with the short form, it would just be a way of unlocking some of the stories that were sort of bubbling around, and just help me kind of get to grips with sort of some of the things that were anecdotes, images, episodes, character sketches, but that had never really been connected. So instead of doing an Arvon on fiction, I did a week at Arvon for poetry. And so I wrote the poem, and I wrote it, I think February 2019. And then as I sort of completed a round of drafts on it and felt that it was ready and maybe ready to go out into the world, I hadn't really considered if it was going to go out into the world, but started to move towards the idea it might go out in the world. My brother then died, and it was the most incredible thing, because I went back to the poem and I thought, this is like a sort of, I didn't really realize it, but it became my grief poem. It became all about how much I missed him and how much I missed the person he was before he was ill. And then after he died, just missing his presence and the person that he'd become after he was ill. So I then, as part, I can't remember if it was before he died or after, but very, very soon around that time, around March time, I started to send it out, and then I stopped. I didn't send it to many places. I just kind of hit send on a couple of things and thought, oh, well, off it goes. But then his birthday came around, and I remember thinking, I need to find somewhere for this poem. And I looked at the Fresher criteria, and I thought, well, maybe. And I definitely sent it to Fresher with the feeling that this is its last little go out in the world. And if it doesn't go anywhere, that's fine. I really need to get on with other stuff, but I've got this poem now as this marker of that moment of losing him. I can't even really say I lost him twice over. I lost him several times over during the course of his illness, and then ultimately with his death. So yeah, that's the poem. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, because obviously it is an incredibly personal story, and I really appreciate you, in a sense, filling in those blanks for us. So what was interesting was Anthony, picked up on so much in a way in his notes, because I think one of the things he said, I've got it here, was about the tobacco being the last thing that you share, and the terribly sad final line, making us feel it's not enough and that time is short, that an end is coming. And and that was obviously so true. You said we're going to Arvon, and for people that don't know, Arvon is this wonderful charitable organisation where you can go and immerse yourself in writing for a week or so at a time. and learn a lot from some really great teachers. And Anthony Dunn, our judge, is actually a teacher at Arvin as well. You said that was in 2019.
Yeah.
So it was only around then that you began to take your writing seriously, or think this is something that I want to explore?
Yes and no. I think I'd been trying to find jobs that would allow me to write alongside them for quite a long time, but I'd done PhD, I'd done teaching, I'd done some journalism, I'd done marketing, all of which are in words, so they were all word jobs. I did a few things that weren't serious, like I wrote a couple of comic plays and staged them, and that was just fun. And I used to write friends' poems for their birthdays or write little character sketches. Wrote loads and loads of synopses of novels that never got written. And then I was just like, what am I doing? This is just, I can carve out the time. I'm just not allowing myself to. I'm just allowing myself to do a million and one other things with my time, including writing a comic play and staging it 2 years in a row. And, it's like, which is great, but writing's quite solitary. And I think you need to be ready to be very disciplined and very focused and just knuckle down.
I think there is that sort of slight sort of the fear of failure as well, isn't there, in most of us, where there's that sort of sense of, well, if I keep saying I haven't got time to do it or whatever, then I don't actually have to expose myself. And also because I think with writing, interestingly, I started with fiction. I kind of always felt that poetry was too difficult. I never felt like I'd learned how to write poetry at school, and so I started with fiction, but then got frustrated with the amount of time you needed to dedicate to fiction, and how you have to almost put all your eggs in one basket.
Yes.
And so for me, I went to Arvin and did a poetry course. And that was lovely because it was just being able to play with short things, feeling of something being finished more quickly. Was really satisfying. But so almost now that you've lit that creative spark, or kind of committed to actually putting things down on paper, so you've now actually started working on a novel as well.
Yes, I have, and I've done some short stories as well, 2 of which were shortlisted for prizes, which
brilliant.
When I started taking the creative writing seriously, I started reading what a lot of writers said about how to start writing. And one of them said, just start entering competitions because it gives you a fake deadline. I was like, yeah, I get that. I need a deadline. I need a deadline. So alongside writing the novel, I committed to entering competitions. And I was thinking, this is crazy. I'm completely diluting what I'm doing because I'm writing a novel. I'm submitting a short story here, a memoir there, a poem there. What am I doing? But actually, it's just practice, isn't it? And it's just also dealing with the fear of failure. I mean, I've entered in the last 12 months. Well, I don't know because I haven't kept count. If I went onto my Submittable account, I might be really shocked and horrified. How many competitions I'd entered and nothing had happened. But, out of those dozens of competitions, I've got some recognition, which is fantastic. But it's also made me write. And I think every time you go and practice writing, when you go back to your core work, you can't help but have improved really what you're doing, because you're just forcing yourself to think about the writing in a different way and not to be so scared. And in fact, it's not really nowadays, as a result of that kind of head work that I've done with myself over the last year, it's not a fear of failure that keeps me away from the page, whereas I think probably before it did used to be. Like a lot of people, I've struggled in lockdown to do anything really coherent. I've sort of dribbled a few words here and there, but, nothing's really kind of happened because I think we are creatures of habit and routine. And when that routine's disrupted and there's other stuff going on, it is quite hard to settle. But no, I would say to any aspiring writer, do some competitions and enter them, and then just forget about them because they're not real. Nobody knows you entered a competition.
I think it's really, really good advice, and quite a few very successful authors, who've taken that route and still do, even though they're very successful, very, well known, they'll still enter competitions for, I don't know, a Radio 4 short story, something like that, just because it's flexing the muscle in different ways all the time, isn't it? And you're exploring. And sometimes if you're writing on the novel, you just want to break. From it. It's like, I'm sick of these characters. Let me do something else. So
yes, absolutely.
So and you're on the Curtis Brown course now, which must be fabulous, I'm assuming.
Yes. No, it's great. So I've now moved on to a mentoring scheme at Curtis Brown, but I was on I think it was Writing Your First Novel. That was a 6-month course that we did in London that finished pretty much 1 week before lockdown. So amazing timing. Yeah. So I got all the in-person seminars and workshops and feedback. And it's been great. I had sort of weighed up, should I go to UEA? Should I go and try and look at doing an MA in creative writing, like you guys do at Bournemouth? But having already lingered far too long in education and at university, I was like, no, just do something short, to the point, where you're getting exposure to industry people. And that's another thing that just kind of blunts your fear of failure, because you understand that, yes, there are a lot of you trying to make your way, but lots of people get through, get their voices heard. It's a job. You may not be paid for it the first year or two. You may never be paid very well for it, but it's a job, and you need to learn how to do it, and you need to learn about the industry. And that's what I think I got from the Curtis Brown. It's sort of short and sweet, but it's really helpful.
I think that's very true, and I think often that's why people come and do an MA, like you say, but sometimes just because it almost gives them that permission to focus that time, like you say, like a job, and push them to that final kind of submission of a project or whatever. It gives that sort of discipline, doesn't it,
definitely
to the work as well. I could talk to you for so long. This is so fascinating. I'd love to hear more about the things that you're currently writing as well, but I'm kind of aware of time ticking on and thinking that really we should hear Brother.
Okay. Brother. He's eking out the tobacco. How much did you bring? His huge hands could crush me. Us, siblings, grappling the Lego, the biscuits, his cap gun. Him, chopping wood, his triceps flexing, his cut-off T-shirt, London calling. We are in Italy. He picks up a rabbit, legs broken by a car, wrings its neck. Him hauling a newborn lamb out of its mother's arse. Sheep are fucking stupid. He is laconic. Him as a baby, his long legs stretched out on the cot bed. He is a sleeping beauty. Legs in cricket whites, his only team. He wakes to catch and bat. He is Icarus at the chalk pit, a steep drop on acid. He is a preacher, strutting and declaiming. His hair is a red fire. He gets mistaken for Jesus. The muscly fight he puts up when the paramedics want to take him to Brighton General. Him, rolling the joints that we shared before he got stingy with his hash. His thumbs, worrying the black lump. Tobacco, all I can offer him, crumbles away.